Welcome to Daily Variety, your daily dose of news and analysis for entertainment industry insiders. It's Thursday, August 7th, 2025. I'm your host, Cynthia Littleton. I am co-editor-in-chief of Variety alongside Ramin Satuda. Today we're taking a departure from the usual format for Daily Variety. This episode is devoted to the house that Adolph Zukor built, Paramount Pictures. It's one of the foundational brands of Hollywood, and today it is formally changing hands. Skydance Media has closed its $8 billion acquisition of Paramount Global. So here we take a long look back at the history and legacy of the Melrose Avenue studio. And we also look to the future, to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead for the new regime led by CEO David Ellison and President Jeff Shell. To help put it all in perspective, we'll speak first with respected Hollywood historian Jeanine Basinger. She talks about what made Paramount unique at its founding in 1912 and what has allowed it to endure for more than a century. Then we'll talk to Peter Debruge and Owen Gleiberman, Variety's chief film critics. They give us a qualitative take on the riches stored in Paramount's vaults. And we finish out with a discussion with media analyst Robert Fishman, senior researcher for MoffettNathanson. He offers thoughts on the business speed bumps ahead and what Wall Street wants to see from the new owners. As Jeanine Basinger explains, Paramount Pictures from the very start was built to produce and distribute movies at scale. Variety had been in business for about 7 years when Adolph Zukor's famous Players film banner joined forces with producers Jesse Lasky, Cecil B. DeMille, and others to create a film factory. The first significant story in Variety about Paramount was published on June 26, 1914. It has great detail of Zukor's vision for how his fledgling studio would operate. He referred to it as the Paramount in those days. It's amazing how much of what he had to say back then is still relevant today. Here's a bite from that report.
The underlying principle, no doubt, of the Paramount formation is the feature film business, in its present unsettled state, must be guarded against. And the Paramount is aimed to become a permanent agency that, when its advantages are made apparent to the picture trade, will be recognized as the proper way to handle output in contrast to the fly-by-night filmmaker who puts a little money into a picture and wants a great deal back, or those feature manufacturers who must have money quickly and will distribute their film regardless to obtain it.
Now we'll hear from Hollywood historian Jeanine Basinger. She is the Corwin Fuller Professor of Film Studies Emerita at Wesleyan University. She sets the scene for us of Paramount's early years and on up through the momentous 1948 antitrust decision that forced Paramount and other studios to divest from their theater chains. She also explains how Mae West saved the studio from bankruptcy in the depths of the Depression. Jeanine Basinger, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you helping me put the storied history of Paramount Pictures into perspective.
Absolutely my pleasure. And you couldn't have a better example to use than Paramount Pictures to depict the history of Hollywood. The great thing about Paramount was, which is now the second oldest studio in the United States after Universal Pictures, is that it founded and grounded itself from the beginning in the understanding you're going to have to look after production, you're going to have to look after distribution, and you're going to have somebody looking ahead to get a plan for the changes that were going to come. And Adolph Zukor, the guy that founded the real Paramount Pictures, with somebody doing those three things very carefully, and he was the look-ahead idea guy. And the sense of buying their own movie theaters and that kind of thing was just very smart.
So, okay, Adolph Zukor, 1912, what was the catalyst for him and his key partners, Jesse Lasky and Cecil B. DeMille? What was the spark to put the stick in the ground and say, we're launching a studio?
It all started with a merger, which is really
Hollywood.
They understood the elements that they were going to need, really, to make it work. You couldn't just be making great movies. You had to have a way to get them out that was great to your public in small towns and everywhere. And you had to have somebody looking out for what you were going to need as a business. For Zukor, he thought it was about stars. Zukor understood that selling the stars, their names, and making them what the audience wanted would be a secret of success. That logo that they have, the original wonderful logo, had 24 stars around the mountain, one for each of the stars that Zukor had cleverly signed up and had under contract. Paramount meant to you movie stars like Bing Crosby and Bob Hope and Paulette Goddard and Veronica Lake and Marlene Dietrich. And in the 30s, it had meant sophistication, a foreign kind of attitude. Everybody said if you went to Paramount, you went into the commissary. It was like you'd gone to a foreign country. There were so many different languages being spoken.
So many great European actors, for obvious reasons, headed across the Atlantic and found a good trade here in the United States.
They gathered there and they made a slightly more sophisticated form of storytelling, often set in Paris instead of Peoria, and women wearing furs and good cloth coats and that kind of thing. And when they had financial trouble, they found Mae West. She saved them from bankruptcy.
She'd been doing her very risque shows on stage, and they ported that over to movies.
They went into receivership and they declared bankruptcy in 1933, but then they came bouncing back from that really largely through having Mae West. Zukor understood you have to be looking ahead. What do you not have? You don't have Mae West. You need block booking. If you have block booking, if you have a star that they want, then they got to buy the other star's material too. So these business practices that were so smart and that define the studio system and then ultimately kill the studios.
It's the central concept of leverage. You have something they want, they'll have to take these 8 others, and therefore scale. There's so much we could talk about, but certainly foundational to the Paramount story is the 1948 antitrust decision. The federal government came in and basically broke up the vertical integration of the day, which was the studios that owned theaters in major cities. And the federal government said to Hollywood, that's just too much power. So Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM, they all had to divest themselves of their theaters. From your research and your studies, what was that moment like for Paramount and for Hollywood?
First of all, the threat from the government about monopoly was around quite a bit before 1948. I mean, in the 30s, everybody was looking at in 1940 on the brink of war. This issue was laid out pretty clearly to Paramount because Paramount owned the most theaters of any studio. But the war came and put everything aside. So in 1948, when the consent decree came down and Paramount was the studio that had to undergo the case because of their theater ownership was so large. I mean, obviously nobody liked it, but the war had brought such boom to the film business. During World War II, the business boomed. It made money hand over fist. Everybody went to the movies and went all the time. And so when it happened, the business was slow to realize what a difference it was going to be. So at first, it was not so terrible, but then suddenly they saw the box office going down, down, down. The business died. That day in 1948, when the Supreme Court made that decision, that is to say, as it existed, the old studio system died, but nobody knew it was dead.
And of course, television at the same time is taking steam as a medium.
And an influx of new foreign films that everybody was trying, which created new appetites for different kinds of movies. It's all about adjustment and looking ahead. That whole Zukor thing, keep the production and the distribution going, but look ahead to what kind of production and what kind of distribution. And that's really the game. That's the game that Paramount has played so successfully for so long, and which they're trying to do again with this new merger. We, as people, need storytellers. and we want stories. We talk about streaming, we talk about money, we talk about many, many things, but what it really is about, we need stories.
Jeanine, thank you so much. I can't think of a better note to end on.
Thank you for having me.
Now we'll get a critic's eye view on Paramount and its influence on the art, science, and commerce of filmmaking. Variety is fortunate to have not one, but two terrific chief film critics. Peter Debruge and Owen Gleiberman, our illustrious chief film critics. Thank you so much for joining me.
Sure. Thanks, Cynthia.
Well, the subject of the morning here is Paramount Pictures, one of Hollywood's foundational brands. Started in 1912, which means it's only a little bit younger than Variety, which of course we started in 1905. As the folks at Skydance Media take over the august Paramount Pictures and the associated assets, I thought it would be good to talk about Paramount Pictures, the history, the library that Skydance is now inheriting. Let me ask you both. In the different eras that the studio has been around, what, if anything, has defined a Paramount picture?
When you think of a Hollywood studio, you probably picture the arches on Melrose Boulevard in front of their studio.
Those ornate iron gates.
When Owen and I spearheaded Variety's greatest films of all time list a couple years ago, we came up with a ton of Paramount movies. And it turns out that our number one film, Psycho, was produced by the studio, when they were working with Hitchcock. We had Psycho, we had Godfather 1 and 2. In the top 10, you've got a number of Paramount films. You've got Apocalypse Now. Paramount is consistently delivering quality movies, as well as sometimes just understanding what audiences want and giving things that are populist hits.
And Peter, they famously won the first Oscar for Best Picture back in 1927.
That's true for Wings, and they've been consistently featuring into the Academy Awards ever since, famously winning the most Oscars for Titanic 70 years after that.
Owen, as we're talking about Paramount, when you think of Paramount, what are some of the first titles that come to your mind?
Well, there are so many. I think Wings points to the idea that Paramount has always been a studio on the cutting edge of where Hollywood is going. It was a studio that invented block booking. It was on the cutting edge of animation, right along with Walt Disney. It was one of the first studios to have a music division and television stations. It made the racy movies that spearheaded the creation of the production code. And then when Paramount was sold to Gulf and Western in 1966, that was the real launch of the corporate age of Hollywood. But then in one of the grandest ironies in movie history, Gulf and Western hired Robert Evans to be head of production, and the new corporate Paramount ended up ushering in a legendary chapter of the new Hollywood. And I would say that the time when Paramount most had a kind of house style, just movies that totally defined it as a studio, was in the new Hollywood era. And I would say what that was is if you think of those great movies that were made under Robert Evans, Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown, the two Godfathers, they were kind of the new Hollywood studio that combined the new sensibility with this Hollywood classicism.
Think about Love Story, a classic hanky weeper if there ever was one. My old boss, Peter Bart, used to just talk about that thing went out and made money for years. They captured that magic.
You felt that Paramount had, retained some of that DNA of the studio system. And at the same time, and it probably wouldn't have happened without Robert Evans, moved into this new era. That's as close to glory days as it never had.
I'm going to throw out also one of my all-time favorite movies, Medium Cool, from the late, great cinematographer and director Haskell Wexler. There's just like a document of the world at that moment.
When you go back to the old days, when I think of Warner Brothers, I think of gangster movies. When I think of Universal, I think of horror. When I think of MGM, I think of musicals. I don't think the name Paramount quite conjures the idea of a house style in that way. But I think as closest that Paramount came to having a house style came much later, even after the Robert Evans period, in the late 70s, when the studios were less distinctive than they had been. But Paramount became the laboratory where they invented the high concept film with movies like Saturday Night Fever, Meatballs, the Friday the 13th series, the Simpson-Bruckheimer films, and the Indiana Jones films. Paramount became associated with very glossy, high-powered commercial content. I personally think the most influential movie of the last 60 years is Raiders of the Lost Ark. That feels to me like a quintessential escapist Paramount creation. This was the era of Barry Diller, Michael Eisner, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and of course, Eisner and Katzenberg then took what they learned at Paramount over to Disney. But Paramount came to represent, in my book, this kind of product. And in some ways, that quality was inseparable from also some of the great and defining movies they made in this period, like An Officer and a Gentleman and Ghost and Forrest Gump.
As you say, those movies, they just work on so many levels. And so interesting, Owen, as all of this is happening on the film side, the TV side of the lot is really stepping up, and you have Gary Marshall inventing television franchises with things like Happy Days, and then came Laverne and Shirley and Mork and Mindy and Joni Loves Chachi. I'm dating myself. And you had two of my all-time television series, Taxi and Cheers.
That's right. And where I think that's important is that when we talk about hyper-commercial aspect of the Paramount style, I think the television was part of it. I think part of what started to happen in certain comedies is that the DNA of television began to merge with movies a little bit. And I think Paramount led that.
Star Trek is a great example.
Well, as we said before, it's not every day that a studio changes hands. And as Paramount goes into the hands of Skydance Media, David Ellison, Jerry Cardinale at Redbird Capital, I hope they're listening to this and understand the qualitative history of this great studio. And certainly they didn't buy it not to make great movies.
It's worth remembering that back in the 80s, the age of Mike Ovitz and high concept, which Paramount more or less paved the way for, everyone back then griped about the new studio mentality, which seemed at the time like a travesty. All these executives caught up in the blockbuster mentality. They seemed to care about nothing but the opening weekend grosses. The creative mentality of the 1970s seemed to have gone out the window.
Right. Agents driving everything with packages.
But in hindsight, those 80s executives and a studio like Paramount now seem like the high renaissance. They were making very commercial movies, but in their way, I think Paramount back then really cared about movies. And you see it in the movies they made that people are still talking about, like The Naked Gun, or The Firm, or Wayne's World, or Clueless, or the Mission Impossible series. They were making a lot of terrific movies. So maybe in that sense, we can be optimistic about this merger, that these new executives under, whatever Skydance Paramount becomes, they're just going to care about content and reduce movies to content. But I'm an optimist, so I say maybe not. Maybe the new Paramount movies can be more than just productions by algorithm.
And if I ran the zoo, you've seen Paramount lately kind of exploiting their catalog and the strength of so many big brands, Indiana Jones, Top Gun, Star Trek. But let's remember that Paramount created all of those brands when they were taking the risks, betting on filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola. That was the lesson of the Robert Evans era. I'd love to see a return to that kind of ethos at Paramount in the future.
Well, I hope David Ellison and Jeff Shell and company are listening. I suspect they will. Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Peter. And now we look to the future of the business in a conversation with Robert Fishman. He's a sharp analyst who covers Paramount Global for the respected independent research firm MoffettNathanson. Robert Fishman, senior researcher for MoffettNathanson, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Cynthia.
It's not every day that a major Hollywood studio, a founding Hollywood studio, changes hands. So I appreciate you looking a little bit ahead. What do you think the first things that Ellison and his new management team are going to have to address at the company they just bought?
I think there's lots of open questions here that remain to be answered. And really what we're looking for, I think what Wall Street is looking for, is really to understand or have a better understanding as to the direction of the company. And what do I really mean by that? It's what is the future of Paramount Plus? That's probably at the top of the list. How much is new management and really going to invest in Paramount Plus and streaming going forward? Clearly, the old regime, if you will, has taken this back to break even. So the losses are gone. But the real question that we all have is, as we look forward, what's the sustainability of that if they've pulled back on some of the content investments? So I think that's big question number one. And the related question around overall content spending for the company is two of these critical questions that investors really need to have a better understanding where the company is going on that.
From an investor perspective, are you looking for David Ellison to come out and say, we're going to put many more billions into production? Or would that give you pause because that just makes the climbing out that much deeper?
I think investing many more billions without understanding what the true payoff is and where the investment is going to go. So if that's all going to be in streaming and taking away from all of the linear investment, that's a pivot that obviously a lot of these media companies have already started to make, including Paramount. But what I would say is which categories of spending is really going to be targeted. So sports is obviously a critical piece to this overall portfolio. Is the company willing to lean into additional sports rights that they think is going to drive new subscribers to Paramount Plus? That's another very clear related question. What is going to be the future of investing in kids content? So you start to go down the list of where that investment is going and what the returns are in today's traditional media ecosystem becomes very different answers than where the company has invested in the past.
It sounds like you're saying that basically all roads for Paramount Global lead through Paramount Plus. Like they really need to make Paramount Plus a bigger player, or at the very least shore up the audience that they have.
I think a big piece of the future of Paramount's news story will be focused around Paramount Plus. But the thing that we can't ignore here is still how important the cash flows are from the traditional cable networks portfolio. So what the future of that portfolio is going to be is another critical question that investors need to understand, especially given what some of the competitors are doing about spinning out and even potentially merging some of these portfolios. So which direction Skydance Paramount tries to take with its linear networks portfolio is going to be another critical piece to this puzzle as far as how investors are going to value this company going forward.
I've read a lot of analysis from you and others about that they don't have as much flexibility as NBC Universal or Warner Brothers Discovery to do that kind of separation because they are so dependent on the cash flows from this. Let me ask you also about something that doesn't get as much attention, but through CBS, Paramount Global owns 28 television stations. What do you think is the future for those stations?
It's a really interesting question. I'd say that the future of their owned and operated TV station portfolio kind of goes hand in hand with the future of Paramount Plus and whether or not they want to continue to drive those linear affiliate fee dollars through retrans, right? That's obviously been a key reason for owning that TV station portfolio looking backwards. And again, how sports plays into that, whether or not they want to use their sports rights to drive those retrans dollars going forward. And really, it comes also down to the bigger picture on TV stations and how the new company wants to deal with their affiliate relationships outside of their owned and operated portfolio. So I think it is a key question that the new management team has to give us a better understanding how they're going to use their linear portfolio and balance that pivot.
In the lead up to this merger, we've heard a lot of discussion from David Ellison and Jeff Shell about the technology capabilities that Skydance Media, that operation can bring to Paramount. And they've been pretty candid that Paramount is behind its larger rivals in this area at a time when no sizable media company can afford to be that much farther behind its competitors. Is there anything that you're going to be specifically looking for in these first few months?
I think in terms of the investment in this technology capabilities, that's really the critical question here. I think we would all agree that traditional media companies need to invest more and to close that gap versus some of the other streaming leaders, with Netflix at the top of the list. So there's clear room for improvement on the technology capabilities and recommendation engines and streaming backend. But at the same time, what will that take in terms of the investment and how can they do that efficiently while still, again, investing in content and investing in the overall business. So it's going to be that continued balancing act of investing in streaming, but where are the dollars coming from? If they're coming from linear, that does obviously make sense given the pressures of that ecosystem. If they're incremental spend over and above what our current expectations are, then it's just something that we need to get a better handle on to understand what the trajectory of the cash flow is going to be for the future of this company.
Robert, my last question for you. Skydance Media, Redbird Capital, do you get the sense that they are going to be in the market for more assets, looking for things that they can bolt on in the rehabilitation of Paramount?
Really, that's the ultimate question that you're leaving us with. To me, the answer is clearly that they have to digest what they just finally acquired first. But I think the best answer I can give you sitting here today is I have a hard time believing that this is it. And I think there's other meaningful combinations out there from some of the peer companies that are also looking to do transformational M&A and figuring out what is the right assets to keep and what's the right assets to sell off. So I think, cable networks, potential streaming combinations, joint ventures, or even full-scale M&A is going to be a lot of how this sector plays out over the coming years.
There will certainly be no shortage of things to watch. Robert, thank you so much for helping us sort through what we need to be focusing on here in the near term. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Listeners, thank you for going with me on this journey through past, present, and a glimpse of Paramount's future. The industry we love has been through hard times of late, but the Paramount story reminds us that hard times don't last forever and change is the only constant. As we close out today's episode, I'm thinking about my late colleague, Hy Hollinger. I had the pleasure of working with Hy in the early 2000s. He was a sharp editor who knew everything there was to know about the international film business. And in his earliest days in Hollywood, Hy worked as an assistant, aka an office boy, for Adolf Zukor. I loved hearing Hy's stories of how the diminutive Zukor was a demanding boss, to say the least. And all these years later, I still love the fact that I worked with someone who worked with one of the undisputed OG founders of Hollywood. Thanks for listening. The soundtrack for this episode includes music from the 1933 Mae West smash, I'm No Angel, as well as the special theme music written for Paramount's 100th anniversary, and the theme from the studio's hit TV series Yellowstone. This episode was written and reported by me, Cynthia Littleton, with contributions from Jeanine Basinger, Peter Debruge, Owen Gleiberman, Robert Fishman, and Clayton Davis. That was Clayton you heard reading the Vintage Variety Report. Sticks, Nicks, Hick Picks. Please leave us a review at the podcast platform of your choice, and please tune in Monday for another episode of Daily Variety.